Revelations chapter 13, verse 16, quote, "All people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, were forced to have a mark. Without the mark of the beast, it was impossible to buy or sell anything." Now, some might take this Bible verse to be a prophetic warning about digital ID. As it so happens, digital ID is about to be rolled out around the world, and it's more evil than anyone could have imagined, except perhaps the author of Revelations, that is. So today, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about digital ID and when it will be coming to your country. Not to be dramatic or anything, but this may be the most important video you'll ever watch. Let's start with a definition of digital ID so we're on the same page. A digital identity is a digital way of proving that you are you. In other words, digital ID is a digital version of the physical IDs that many of us have, be that a national ID card, a health card, driver's license, or passport. Like physical IDs, a digital ID is issued or accredited by the government and requires basic biometric information to create. Biometric information includes any physical attributes that are unique to you, such as your face, your fingerprint, or your iris, the coloured part of your eye. Unlike physical ID documents, a digital ID is stored on an electronic device such as your phone or computer. However, all the data about your digital ID is technically stored by the government or by whichever private company the government has contracted for this purpose. This is a small but significant detail because it means that digital ID systems are extremely centralized and ultimately outside of your control. The government or private company which issues the digital ID has the power to make changes to your digital ID without your consent, including deleting it. Although the government or company which issues your physical ID has access to the same personal information, making changes to your physical ID requires physically confiscating it from you. This is obviously much more difficult to do than changing a few of your settings in a digital ID system. However, the biggest difference between physical IDs and digital IDs is that there are multiple different types of physical IDs, each with their own issuing institution or authority. With a digital ID, your national ID card, your health card, your driver's license, your passport, and even your bank card are all rolled into one. While digital ID systems are only just starting to be rolled out, the research and development so far suggests that your digital ID will be connected to absolutely everything. It'll be linked to the assets you own, it'll be integrated into voting systems, and it could even be required to access the internet. Now, advocates of digital ID insist that these systems will make everything more efficient, more inclusive, and of course, much safer. However, it should be clear by now that digital ID systems have the power to become more evil than anything any religious text could have possibly predicted. Besides making changes to your actual digital ID, the government or private company would have the power to prevent you from purchasing goods or accessing services, including all of those I just mentioned. In short, a digital ID system would be one of total top-down control with no escape. And it's a system that every single country will be rolling out in the coming years. Now, if you're wondering where this supposedly universal push for digital ID is coming from, the answer appears to be the United Nations, or UN. Introducing digital ID is part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, that member states must meet by 2030, which is literally every country. If you watched our video about the individual carbon credit system the UN is planning, you'll know that the UN is working closely with the private sector, the public sector, and with other international organizations to ensure that all 17 SDGs are met in every country by 2030. The international organization that's been the most involved with the UN's SDG initiative is the one and only World Economic Forum, or WEF. For those unfamiliar, the WEF consists of over 4,000 of the world's most powerful individuals and has almost every major institution on its members list as well. The WEF signed a strategic partnership with the UN in mid-2019 to, quote, jointly accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To that end, the WEF has been pushing the SDGs through ESG with the help of BlackRock, Bank of America, and others. More about the ESG investment ideology using the link in the description. Now, it's important to note that the WEF is not the only organisation that's been involved in the rollout of digital ID. What's fascinating is the organisations pushing digital ID seem to fall into two categories. The first represents private sector interests, and the second represents public sector interests. Logically, the private sector and the public sector both have a lot to gain by rolling out digital ID systems. For the private sector, the primary benefit is an increase in economic participation and profits therefrom. For the public sector, the primary benefit is an increase in surveillance and control. Naturally, the WEF represents private sector interests. Now, the other two organisations aggressively pushing digital ID are the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. The World Bank has been especially active in the development of digital ID. It's been testing digital ID systems in Africa and India for years. In a discussion about digital ID from December 2020, Mari Pangestu, the managing director of the World Bank, explicitly stated that the organization's digital ID development would not be possible without its partners, specifically the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Note, folks, that all sources for this are in the description if you don't believe me. Now, when it comes to public sector interests in digital ID, there seem to be three organizations that have been aggressively pushing for it. The first is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The second is the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, and the third is the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. Those of you who followed the channel for any length of time will be familiar with all three. For the IMF and the BIS, the interest in digital ID comes from the fact that digital ID is required for governments to roll out their central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Both organizations have explicitly stated this in various reports and blog posts. For the FATF, the interest in digital ID seems to come from the desire of public institutions to standardize digital ID systems around the world. In March 2020, the FATF published a lengthy report suggesting digital ID standards. This is much more significant than you think. That's because the FATF has the power to coerce countries to comply with its so-called recommendations by issuing related regulations in their jurisdictions. Digital ID falls under FATF Recommendation 10, which is due diligence, aka background checks, on individuals and institutions. Given that the purpose of the FATF's recommendations is to essentially ensure the status quo of the current financial system, I expect that it will eventually require all countries to ensure that all crypto wallets and services are connected to digital IDs, at which point most cryptos will be no different from most CBDCs. A failure to comply will probably result in financial and social restrictions, or worse. By now, you're probably wondering when digital ID will be coming to your country. Well, it looks like almost every country will have a national digital ID by 2025. This is the timeline given by the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, in a report it published in February this year. The report is titled, quote, Digital Strategy 2022 to 2025, and I'll leave a link to it in the description because it is seriously insane. For starters, the report reveals that the UNDP's digital strategy was first announced in mid-2019, almost exactly when the WEF signed its partnership with the UN. The report also repeatedly states that the pandemic accelerated the development of digital ID around the world. It reveals that over 60 countries worked with the UNDP to deploy over 250 digital ID solutions. This